This episode of Accessibility is going to be a little bit different from my usual episodes. It's not scripted. I just wanted to kind of sit down and talk from the heart on this one a little bit. As many of you will know, I don't usually cover Ubisoft games. Maybe once a year or so there is an exception, a game that laser targets my accessibility needs in some new and novel way, or that does something so important to the accessibility space that I cannot ignore talking about it. But in the past several years, I've largely not covered Ubisoft's games as a result of the stories that came out about abuse of workers within the company and follow up stories that seem to imply that a lot of that didn't improve at certain places in the company. But as I say, every now and then a Ubisoft game will do something that absolutely drills into something I've been begging the industry to do accessibility wise, and I need to have some space to sit and talk about it. So, here's the short version. For the past 4.5 years, I have been advocating for the idea that video games could be more accessible to autistic players like myself by making the emotional tone of dialogue and non-verbal subtext explicit via a dedicated subtitle track. I most recently made this argument literally 2 weeks ago in an episode of Accessibility talking about ways that the industry could move forward with autistic player accessibility. The example of this that for years I've pointed to is this scene that shows up in Marvel's Avengers. I made a video about this in late 2020. There is a scene in which Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, is sat in the front of a car with Bruce Banner, and she's deliberately slurping a drink to try and get a rise out of Bruce, and Bruce is making eye gestures back, and the game included subtitles explaining the non-verbal subtext of what was going on in that scene. And I've not been able to stop thinking about that for years. As an autistic person who struggles with consistently understanding tone of voice and intended non-verbal subtext, this was not a dedicated option, but it existed for a moment, and it was really impactful to me. For years, I have been trying professionally and publicly to argue that it would be great to see this kind of idea put into practice as a dedicated, deliberate accessibility option in a game. So, about a day before making this video, I learned that Assassin's Creed Shadows apparently included an emotion captions option in its settings menu. To say that I got overwhelmed by this knowledge would be an understatement. In practice, I have some issues with the execution now that I've played around with it a bit, and there is definitely room for expanding this feature in future, but this is a really important first step on the road to explicit communication of non-verbal subtext as a feature being taken seriously, and I can't overstate how important a milestone this is to me. So, what does this setting do? If you turn on the emotion caption setting in Assassin's Creed Shadows, it turns on tone tags for subtitles. Next to the speaker name in subtitles, it will give you just a little one-word description of the emotional tone of how that line of dialogue is being read. Sometimes that will just say neutral, sometimes it will give a specific emotion that is intended to have been conveyed by the line of dialogue. Now, there's a little bit of inconsistency in how this feature is implemented. Sometimes a neutral tone is tagged with the word neutral, sometimes it's not, sometimes there's just no tone tag for neutral dialogue. Um, there's a couple of little things I wish could be different. I wish that you could just turn on the emotion subtitles by themselves. Currently, you have to have main dialogue subtitles turned on Otherwise, you can't have any of the other subtitle options toggled. And if you turn off speaker names, it also turns off these emotion tone indicators. You can't just have the emotion by itself on that line if you don't need the speaker name. Part of me does kind of wish that I could either have just the emotional tone subtitle on screen, or set them to be like a separate color so that I could quickly read that emotional tone information at a quick glance easily, rather than having to visually scan for it in between the speaker name and the rest of the subtitle. But the option exists for basically every line of dialogue in the game. Any line of dialogue where tone is important to understanding the intention of the line of dialogue, the game explicitly labels what emotion the line is being said with, and that is so unbelievably useful. There is a step further that I do believe this could go. Assassin's Creed Shadows has audio-described cutscenes for blind players, and these include descriptions of non-verbal visual subtext. I'll include an example in the video here.
We pledged our oaths to her, and they died with her.
The two men glare at each other. Sandayu's gaze shifts to Naue, then he returns his attention to Nagato with a look of resignation.
Do what you must. I understand.
I would love for a game like this to give me the option to have this description of non-verbal visual subtext written as text as a subtitle track. I would love to see an emotion captions subtitle track offer the option to have this information from the audio descriptions as a subtitle track. Basically, give me a subtitle track that explains the emotions of actions, not just the emotions of the dialogue lines, like that Marvel's Avengers scene that I showed earlier. The audio description track is already written, the work is done. Give us some of the lines from that audio description track as text in a subtitle track. That, I think, is the next step that a game like this could take to really evolve what it's offering here as emotion captions. This is a small step, one that, as I say, could be tweaked and improved and could be more valuable in its execution than it is. There are next steps that could be taken. But to me, this is a really huge step and something that I'm kind of choking up talking about. I have been trying to advocate for emotion subtitles as a feature for literal years, both as an accessibility consultant meeting with game developers, and as someone making publicly facing content trying to sort of educate on ideas about accessibility. And I've repeatedly been told by game developers that there is no precedent for doing this because no one has tried it, and without a precedent, it's going to be a hard sell to the higher-ups to spend money implementing this. Now there is a game I can point to, a big-budget game that deliberately included explicit emotion information as a subtitle track. That's going to help so much in getting the ball rolling on convincing other people to try implementing this in their games. It's once is a fluke, two is a pattern, and I can now point at Marvel's Avengers, but also Assassin's Creed Shadows, and make an argument for this being something that should be repeated and expanded upon. I know that this emotion subtitle setting probably isn't intended for me as an autistic player. It probably was not designed to be autistic player accessibility. It is most likely meant to be for deaf players who can't hear the verbal delivery of lines from voice actors, to make sure that they are able to understand the tone that's meant to be conveyed by the voice acting. And I also recognize that its utility isn't unique in helping autistic players. It's going to help groups beyond myself, such as those who may not recognize tone when voice-acted dialogue is in a foreign language. But I want to believe that after years of beating this drum professionally and publicly, that someone in the industry has heard my pleas and in some small part considered the impact this will have for myself and other autistic gamers. Getting to see a video game include explicit information about non-verbal delivery of voice acting lines, making the intended emotion I'm supposed to be able to hear in a line of voice acting that I struggle to pick up on explicit information that I just get to know for sure rather than questioning or getting wrong or missing entirely. It's hard to overstate quite how meaningful that is, and I just want to say thank you to whoever out there put this in this game.